The scorching Pacific sun beat down mercilessly on Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's weathered face as he stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, his flagship cutting through the cerulean waters toward what would become history's most decisive naval engagement. It was the morning of June 4, 1942, and the Imperial Japanese Navy's most experienced carrier commander found himself trapped in an impossible decision that would paralyze him at the most critical moment of the Pacific War. Nagumo's eyes swept across the horizon where three other massive carriers, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, maintained perfect formation in the early dawn light. These floating fortresses represented the cream of Japan's naval aviation, the same strike force that had devastated Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier. Yet something felt different this morning, something that gnawed at the veteran admiral's instincts like a persistent ache. The plan seemed flawless on paper. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, architect of Pearl Harbor and Japan's greatest naval strategist, had conceived Operation MI as the decisive blow that would force America to the negotiating table. The capture of Midway Atoll would extend Japan's defensive perimeter, while simultaneously drawing out the remnants of the American Pacific Fleet for annihilation. 4 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, numerous cruisers and destroyers, the most powerful naval force Japan had ever assembled, steamed toward what Yamamoto believed would be certain victory. But as Nagumo reviewed the morning's intelligence, reports in his cramped quarters, doubt crept into his mind like fog rolling in from the sea. The American presence at Midway seemed more substantial than anticipated. Radio intercepts suggested unusual activity, and reconnaissance flights had reported suspicious movements. Still, the plan must proceed. Too much depended on it. Commander. Minoru Genda, Nagumo's brilliant air operations officer and one of Pearl Harbor's masterminds, burst into the Admiral's quarters with barely contained excitement. "Admiral, the first strike wave is ready for launch against Midway. 108 aircraft, dive bombers, torpedo planes, and fighters. We'll crush their defenses before they know we're here." Nagumo nodded grimly, knowing that once those planes left his decks, he would be committed to a course from which there could be no retreat. The Kido Butai, Japan's mobile striking force, had never known defeat, but something about this morning felt ominous. Perhaps it was the unusual radio chatter his communications officers had been monitoring, or maybe it was the nagging feeling that they were walking into a trap carefully laid by an enemy who had learned too much from Pearl Harbor's harsh lessons, as the first wave of Japanese aircraft roared off the carrier decks at precisely 600 hours, filling the sky with the thunder of radial engines and the promise of destruction. Nagumo made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He held back a second strike wave, keeping them armed and ready on the flight decks, uncertain whether to commit them to the Midway attack or preserve them for the expected American fleet response. This moment of hesitation, this split second of uncertainty in the mind of Japan's most experienced carrier commander, would soon cascade into a paralysis that would cripple Japanese decision-making at the very peak of the battle. The sun climbed higher, and with it, the temperature of what would become the most important day in naval aviation history. The radio crackled with static as Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga's voice cut through the morning air, his words carrying across the vast Pacific from the skies above Midway Atoll back to Admiral Nagumo's flagship. "Second strike necessary. Enemy defenses stronger than expected. Repeat. Second strike necessary against Midway." Nagumo's knuckles whitened as he gripped the message pad, his mind racing through the implications. At 700 hours on June 4, 1942, the most critical decision of the Pacific War hung in the balance, and Japan's most experienced carrier commander found himself paralyzed between competing priorities that would determine the fate of nations. Commander Genda stood beside his admiral, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool morning breeze across Akagi's flight deck. Below them, 93 aircraft of the second strike wave sat ready, some armed with armor-piercing bombs for ship attack, others with high-explosive bombs for ground targets. The decision of how to arm them had seemed academic hours earlier. Now it represented the difference between victory and catastrophe. "Admiral," Genda pressed, his voice tight with urgency, "Tomonaga's message indicates Midway's defenses are intact. We need that second strike to neutralize their airfield before they can launch a counterattack." But even as Genda spoke, Another report arrived that would further complicate Nagumo's agonizing decision. At 7:28 hours, reconnaissance, pilot Amari Tone 4 reported the sighting of American ships to the northeast, ships that hadn't been there according to intelligence estimates. The report was frustratingly vague. 10 enemy surface ships bearing 10 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. Nagumo's staff officers crowded around the chart table, their voices rising in heated debate. Captain Taijiro Aoki, Akagi's commanding officer, argued for immediate preparation against the American fleet. If there are American carriers out there, Admiral, we must strike them first. That has always been our doctrine. Destroy the enemy's carriers before they can launch against us. Yet the message from Tone 4 remained maddeningly incomplete. Were these American ships accompanied by carriers? Were they merely cruisers and destroyers? Or did they represent the main American fleet? The pilot had failed to specify the most crucial detail, the composition of the enemy force. According to naval historian Gordon Pranga's definitive account, Miracle at Midway, this moment of uncertainty would prove to be the fulcrum upon which the entire battle turned. At 7:45 hours, Nagumo made his first fatal decision. Unable to determine the exact nature of the American force and unwilling to leave Midway's airfield operational, he ordered the second strike wave to be rearmed with high-explosive bombs for ground attack. Crews swarmed over the aircraft on Akagi. Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu, frantically switching ordnance while precious minutes ticked away. The hangar decks became scenes of controlled chaos as aviation ordnance men worked to remove armor-piercing bombs and replace them with high-explosive variants. The process was methodical but time-consuming, requiring careful handling of volatile weapons in the confined spaces below deck. Sweat-soaked sailors cursed the heat and the urgency as they wrestled with 500-pound bombs, knowing that, somewhere beyond the horizon, American forces were moving toward them with unknown intentions. But at 809 hours, another message from Tone 4 shattered whatever certainty Nagumo had managed to construct. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be aircraft carrier. The words hit the Admiral like a physical blow, confirming his worst fears while simultaneously making his earlier decision to rearm for Midway attack seem catastrophically wrong. Nagumo's paralysis deepened as the implications crashed over him, like successive waves. If American carriers were indeed present, his scattered first strike wave, still attacking Midway, would return to find their own carriers under attack. Yet if he immediately reversed his rearming order, the confusion and delay would leave his force vulnerable for even longer. Standing on Akagi's bridge as the morning sun climbed higher, Admiral Nagumo faced the crushing weight of command at the moment when hesitation would prove more deadly than any enemy torpedo. The thunder of returning engines filled the sky above the Kido Butai as Lieutenant Tomonaga's strike force approached. Their carriers at 830 hours on June 4, 1942. Admiral Nagumo watched through his binoculars as the first wave of Japanese aircraft, battered and bullet-riddled from their assault on Midway, began forming up for landing. Several planes trailed smoke, and he could see gaping holes in wings and fuselages that spoke of fierce American resistance. Below on the flight decks of all four carriers, organized chaos reigned as crews scrambled to complete the second rearming cycle of the morning. The armor-piercing bombs that had been removed 90 minutes earlier were now being hastily reinstalled as Nagumo's staff finally acknowledged the presence of American carriers to the northeast. Aviation ordnance men, their uniforms soaked with sweat and oil, cursed the contradictory orders that had them switching bomb loads for the second time in less than 2 hours. Commander Genda approached his admiral with barely controlled frustration etched across his usually calm features. "Admiral, we must make a decision now. The first strike wave is critically low on fuel, and many aircraft are damaged. We cannot recover them while armed aircraft occupy the flight deck." Nagumo's paralysis had reached its peak. Every option before him carried catastrophic risks. If he launched his strike against the American carriers immediately, his returning Midway attack force would have nowhere to land and would be lost to fuel exhaustion. If he recovered his aircraft first, the Americans might strike while his carriers were most vulnerable. Flight decks crowded with planes, aviation fuel lines open, and ordnance scattered throughout the ships. Captain Aoki of the Akagi pressed forward with his own urgent counsel. Admiral, radio intelligence indicates the Americans have launched aircraft. If we delay our strike much longer, we may face their attack with our decks full of returning planes and no combat air patrol aloft. The veteran commander found himself trapped in a web of his own making. For 30 years, Nagumo had built his reputation on careful calculation and methodical execution. He was not a man given to rash decisions or desperate gambles. Yet here, at the most critical moment of the Pacific War, his methodical nature had become his greatest weakness. At 835 hours, the decision was made for him. Lookouts aboard the destroyer. Nowaki spotted aircraft approaching from the northeast, American torpedo bombers flying low over the water in attack formation. The moment for choice had passed. Now came the time for consequences. All aircraft. "Prepare for immediate launch," Nagumo ordered. But even as he spoke, he knew it was too late. His strike force was caught in the worst possible position. Some aircraft still being rearmed, others returning from Midway desperately low on fuel, and the flight decks of all 4 carriers cluttered with planes, fuel lines, and ordnance that would become deadly weapons in the hands of American dive bombers. The first wave of American attackers, 15 Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers from the USS Hornets Torpedo Squadron 8, came in low and straight, their obsolete aircraft struggling to reach attack position against the concentrated fire of the Japanese fleet. Lieutenant Commander John Waldron led his men with suicidal courage, knowing their ancient planes were no match for the Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters that rose to meet them. Contemporary accounts from survivors, as documented in Walter Lord's incredible victory, described the next few minutes as the most intense of the entire Pacific War. Nagumo watched in grim satisfaction as his fighters and anti-aircraft guns tore apart the American torpedo attack. 14 of the 15 Devastators were shot down, their crews dying in the blue Pacific waters without scoring a single hit on the Japanese carriers. A second torpedo squadron from the Enterprise suffered similar devastation, losing 10 of 14 aircraft. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Japanese superiority in training and equipment would prevail despite the morning's confusion. Nagumo's fighter pilots had performed magnificently, and his carriers remained untouched. But in focusing so intently on the low-flying torpedo bombers, every Japanese fighter had been drawn down to sea level, leaving the high-altitude approaches completely undefended. At 10:26 hours, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's dive, bombers from the Enterprise appeared out of the sun like avenging angels, their Douglas SBD Dauntless aircraft perfectly positioned for the most devastating attack in naval aviation history. The Japanese leadership's paralysis was about to reap its terrible harvest. The screaming dive bombers plummeted from the azure Pacific sky like mechanical hawks, their Douglas SBD Dauntless aircraft diving at angles so steep that Admiral Nagumo could see their bomb bay doors opening as they approached his flagship. At 10:26 hours on June 4, 1942, the paralysis that had gripped Japanese war leadership throughout the morning was about to be shattered by 5 minutes of devastation that would change the course of the Pacific War forever. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's Enterprise dive bombers had found the Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable moment. The flight decks of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were crowded with aircraft in various stages of preparation. Some being refueled, others having their ordnance loaded, and the returning Midway strike force still circling overhead waiting to land. Aviation fuel lines snaked across the wooden flight decks like arteries carrying lifeblood to a heart that was about to stop beating. Commander Genda watched in horror from Akagi's bridge as the first American bomb struck the Kaga. The 1,000-pound weapon punched through the flight deck and exploded deep within the ship's hangar, igniting aviation fuel and ordnance in a chain reaction that transformed Japan's second-largest carrier into a floating inferno within seconds. The explosion was so violent that it could be felt aboard Nagumo's flagship 3 miles away. "American dive bombers," screamed the lookouts, but their warnings came too late. The Japanese fighter cover, drawn down to sea level by the earlier torpedo attacks, was climbing desperately to intercept the diving Dauntlesses, but physics and geometry were against them. The American pilots had achieved perfect tactical surprise, arriving at precisely the moment when the Japanese fleet was least prepared to defend itself. Aboard the Soryu, Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto watched his flight deck erupt in flames as 3 Direct hits turned his carrier into a blazing wreck. The bombs detonated among aircraft being prepared for launch, creating secondary explosions that ripped through the ship's structure like thunderclaps. Within minutes, the carrier that had helped devastate Pearl Harbor was listing heavily to port, her flight deck a twisted mass of burning metal and shattered dreams of empire. Admiral Nagumo stood frozen on Akagi's bridge as Lieutenant Dick Best's section of dive bombers rolled into their attack on his flagship. The lead bomber's 1,000-pound weapon struck just aft of the midship's elevator, penetrating to the upper hangar deck, where it detonated among 18 fully fueled and armed aircraft. The explosion lifted the massive steel elevator platform and hurled it against the bridge structure, missing Nagumo by mere yards. The scene on Akagi's hangar deck became a vision of maritime hell as aviation fuel spread burning rivulets throughout the ship's interior spaces. Ordnance cooked off in staccato bursts, sending shrapnel ricocheting through compartments filled with smoke and flame. Sailors stumbled through the acrid darkness, their training taking over even as their world disintegrated around them. Naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison later wrote in his official history that these 5 minutes represented the most decisive moment in the Pacific War, when American dive bombers destroyed in minutes what Japan had spent years building. Captain Aoki rushed to Nagumo's side, his uniform singed and his face blackened with smoke. "Admiral, we must transfer your flag. Akagi cannot be saved. The fires are out of control." But Nagumo remained motionless, staring at the destruction spreading throughout his fleet, with the expression of a man watching his life's work crumble into ash. The methodical commander who had spent the morning paralyzed by indecision was now paralyzed by the consequences of that indecision. 3 of his 4 aircraft carriers were burning wrecks, their flight decks twisted, and their hangars transformed into crematoriums for Japan's most experienced naval aviators. The Hiryu, positioned several miles away from her sister ships, had escaped the initial American attack and was frantically preparing a counterstrike. But even as her aircraft prepared for launch, the mathematical reality of the situation was becoming clear to those Japanese officers still capable of rational thought. In 5 minutes of devastating precision bombing, American naval aviation had accomplished what months of strategic planning had failed to achieve: the destruction of Japan's offensive naval capability in the Pacific. Commander Genda, his face pale with shock and recognition of the disaster unfolding around them, approached his admiral one final time. "Sir, we must abandon ship. The fires have reached the magazines." Finally, Admiral Nagumo moved. Not toward salvation or tactical recovery, but deeper into the paralysis that had defined his morning. The man who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, who had commanded Japan's most powerful naval force, could only watch as the flames consuming his flagship reached toward the bridge where he stood frozen in time and space, a symbol of leadership. Paralyzed at the moment when decisive action might have salvaged something from the wreckage of Japanese naval supremacy. Through the billowing smoke and screaming chaos of 3 burning aircraft carriers, Admiral Nagumo finally stirred from his paralyzing shock at 1100 hours on June 4, 1942. The acrid smell of burning aviation fuel and the distant explosions of cooking ordnance filled his nostrils as he was helped down from Akagi's bridge to the destroyer Nowaki, his flag staff supporting him like pallbearers at his own funeral. Captain Tomeo Kaku of the Hiryu had assumed tactical command of what remained of the Kido Butai, and his lone surviving aircraft carrier represented Japan's final hope for salvaging something from the morning's catastrophe. Unlike his paralyzed superior, Kaku understood that desperate situations demanded desperate measures. While Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu burned like floating pyres behind him, he ordered his remaining aircraft into the sky for a counterattack that would either restore Japanese naval supremacy or complete the destruction of Yamamoto's carefully crafted strategy. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led 18 Aichi D-3A dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters off Hiryu's flight deck at 10:58 hours, their destination the American carriers that had dealt such devastating punishment to the Japanese fleet. The young pilot understood the weight of history resting on his squadron's wings. They carried not just bombs and bullets, but the hopes of an empire that had believed itself invincible until this terrible morning. Aboard the now crippled Akagi, Damage control parties fought a losing battle against fires that had spread throughout the ship's interior spaces. Commander Genda, his uniform torn and his hands burned from helping wounded sailors, found Admiral Nagumo sitting in stunned silence on the destroyer's bridge. The brilliant tactical mind that had orchestrated Pearl Harbor seemed unable to process the magnitude of the disaster that had befallen his command. "Admiral," Genda said quietly, his voice barely audible above the sound of distant explosions, "we must consider our options. Hiryu still has striking power, and our heavy ships remain intact. Perhaps we can still salvage this operation." Nagumo turned slowly toward his air operations officer, his eyes reflecting the flames that consumed his flagship on the horizon. "Options, Genda? What options remain when 3/4 of our carrier strength burns behind us? We have lost in 5 minutes what took 20 years to build." The truth of those words hung heavy in the salt air as Kobayashi's strike force found their targets. The American carriers Enterprise and Yorktown were operating 30 miles northeast of the burning Japanese ships, their own flight decks busy recovering the dive bombers that had wrought such destruction on the Kido Butai. The Japanese pilots, driven by desperation and the samurai code that demanded death before defeat, pressed their attack with suicidal determination. At 1220 hours, Kobayashi's bombers dove on the Yorktown with the fury of men who knew they were fighting for more than tactical advantage. They were fighting for the survival of their nation's naval supremacy. 3 bombs struck the American carrier, causing significant damage and forcing her to reduce speed. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Japanese skill and determination might yet snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. According to Walter Lord's comprehensive account, "Incredible Victory," this attack represented the last gasp of Japanese offensive capability at Midway, a final spasm of violence from a mortally wounded naval force. But even as Yorktown burned, American reinforcements were already in the air. The Enterprise had launched a second strike against the Hiryu, and Lieutenant Commander Earl Gallagher's dive bombers were approaching Japan's last operational aircraft carrier with the same deadly precision that had destroyed her sister ships hours earlier. At 1700 hours, as the Pacific sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Gallagher's bombers found the Hiryu attempting to recover her returning aircraft. The American SBDs dove through minimal fighter opposition. Most of Hiryu's Zeros had been lost escorting the morning's attacks, and delivered 4 direct hits that transformed Japan's final carrier into another floating funeral pyre. Captain Kaku, mortally wounded by the bombing but still conscious, managed to signal his final message to the combined fleet headquarters. "Hiryu attacked by enemy dive bombers. Ship on fire and listing. Will continue to fight to the end." As darkness fell over the Pacific battlefield, Admiral Nagumo stood on the bridge of the destroyer Milwaukee, watching the funeral pyres of 4 aircraft carriers light the night sky, like beacons marking the death of Japanese naval aviation. The paralysis that had gripped him throughout the morning had given way to a different kind of numbness. The recognition that his hesitation and indecision had cost Japan not just a battle, but potentially the entire war. The man who had awakened, that morning commanding the most powerful naval strike force in history, would sleep as the commander of a broken fleet, his leadership paralysis having contributed to one of the most decisive defeats in naval warfare. The pre-dawn darkness of June 5, 1942, found Admiral Chuichi Nagumo standing alone on the bridge wing of the destroyer Milwaukee, his eyes fixed on the dying embers that had once been the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, now rested on the Pacific floor, their twisted hulks carrying with them over 200 aircraft, and Japan's most experienced naval aviators to their watery graves. The radio room aboard Admiral Yamamoto's flagship Yamato, positioned 300 miles to the west, crackled with increasingly desperate messages as the architect of Pearl Harbor struggled to comprehend the magnitude of the disaster that had befallen his carefully orchestrated plan. Captain Kuroshima, Yamamoto's chief of staff, approached his commander with the latest damage reports, his face pale in the dim light of the communications center. "Admiral," Kuroshima said quietly, "Admiral Nagumo reports total loss of all 4 fleet carriers. Enemy carrier forces remain largely intact. The Midway operation cannot be sustained. Yamamoto closed his eyes and seemed to age 10 years in the span of a single breath. The man who had warned his government that Japan could run wild in the Pacific for 6 months to a year had just witnessed the end of that period of dominance. The mathematical reality was inescapable. Without carrier aviation, Japan's ability to project power across the vast Pacific had been crippled, perhaps permanently. Aboard the Nowaki, Commander Genda found his admiral still standing vigil over the graveyard of Japanese naval aviation. The brilliant tactical mind that had conceived the Pearl Harbor attack was now wrestling with the recognition that tactical paralysis at the critical moment had undone years of strategic planning and preparation. "Admiral," Genda ventured carefully, "Admiral Yamamoto is requesting your assessment of the situation. What should I tell him?" Nagumo turned slowly, his weathered face reflecting the exhaustion of a man who had watched his life's work consumed by flames. "Tell him the truth, Genda. Tell him that I hesitated when decisiveness was required, that I changed course when commitment was necessary, and that my paralysis at the moment of crisis has cost the Empire its finest ships and bravest men." Diwan. Admission hung heavy in the salt air, a recognition of leadership failure that would echo through the halls of Japanese naval headquarters and ultimately to the imperial palace itself. Nagumo's paralysis had not occurred in a vacuum. It was the product of a command structure that had grown overconfident, intelligence failures that had left him blind to American capabilities, and a tactical doctrine that had not adequately prepared for the complexities of multi-dimensional naval warfare. Military historian John Keegan later observed in The Price of Admiralty that Midway demonstrated how individual command decisions, particularly in moments of crisis, could determine the fate of entire civilizations. As the sun rose over the Pacific on June 5th, painting the water crimson like the blood of fallen samurai, the full implications of the previous day's disaster began to crystallize in Japanese strategic thinking. Without their aircraft carriers, Japan's defensive perimeter would contract dramatically. The planned invasions of New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa would have to be canceled. Most critically, Japan would be forced into a defensive posture for the remainder of the war, fighting desperately to hold what they had gained rather than expanding their empire further. The psychological impact proved equally devastating. The myth of Japanese invincibility, carefully cultivated since the Meiji Restoration and reinforced by early Pacific victories, lay shattered on the ocean floor alongside the Kido Butai. American industrial capacity, which Japanese strategists had consistently underestimated, would now have time to reach full wartime production without the threat of carrier-based attacks on West Coast facilities. Admiral Nagumo's request to be relieved of command was quietly accepted by Naval General Staff, his distinguished career ending not in the blaze of glory that Japanese naval tradition demanded, but in the ashes of paralyzed leadership. He would be assigned to shore duties, spending the remainder of the war training replacement pilots who would never achieve the skill level of those lost at Midway. In the years that followed, as American forces island-hopped across the Pacific toward Japan itself, naval historians would debate the precise moment when the tide of war turned irreversibly against the empire of the rising sun. But for those who lived through June 4th, 1942, there was no debate. The paralysis of Japanese war leadership at Midway's peak had transformed a tactical engagement into a strategic catastrophe from which Japan would never recover. The great gamble had failed, and with it, Japan's dream of Pacific domination sank beneath the waves alongside the burning wreckage of 4 aircraft carriers and the paralyzed leadership that had failed them at their moment of greatest need.